Thanks, Alex. Before we get started, I just wanted to echo Sam's thoughts earlier, to echo the sense of pride and gratitude that I feel, that I associate with YIVO, and the great pride that I take in all the work that I do, but also all the work that my colleagues do, especially those who are now working in the YIVO orbit most closely. I think you've achieved so much over the past few years, and I'm just in awe of all that you've achieved. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the panelists one by one, and our first one, and two of them actually will be coming in via the screen, one by Zoom and another as a pre-recorded talk. So yes, and then finally one in person. So we're mixing it up today. And our first panelist is Leyzer Burko. He is a Yiddish researcher and a language teacher with a doctorate from the Jewish Theological Seminary. And the topic of his dissertation was the work of the YIVO Linguistics Circle. His talk today is called The New York YIVO on the Language Front, 1940 to 1970. I guess you take it away? Okay.
I can see myself, so that means you can probably see me. I'm sorry I'm just a big head on the screen. I'm sorry to disappoint my mother also, who I'm sure is in the audience. But what can we do? Okay, I'm very happy to talk about this topic because this is the topic I spent a lot of time with researching my dissertation. And it just happens to fit into this conference very nicely. So the topic is the work of the YIVO linguists in America in the post-war period. This is an informal group that was known as the YIVO Linguistics Circle, and it was sort of a successor to the pre-war YIVO philological section, and it was active from about 1940 to about 1970. The group included YIVO's director, Max Weinreich, and it produced a lot of the best scholarship that we have on Yiddish and in Yiddish. Max Weinreich and Uriel Weinreich, his son, they were some of the first Yiddish professors at American universities, and they helped introduce the field of Yiddish studies and the study of Jewish languages generally to a wider audience. The Yiddish speech community was obviously in decline in post-war America, since most speakers were immigrants who had arrived before 1923, when immigration was restricted. Only about 100,000 Jewish survivors and other refugees arrived in the years after World War II. Nevertheless, post-war America offered Yiddish scholars many new opportunities. First, a few became professors at American universities, a form of employment which had not been available to them in Europe, and which only a handful of Jewish studies scholars had attained in America before the war. American universities entered a boom period thanks to the GI Bill and then the baby boomers. Quotas and restrictions on Jewish students were removed, and many students came from Yiddish-speaking homes. Thousands of ordinary Jews contributed to Yiddish scholarship as dialect informants, volunteers, readers, donors. The Holocaust and the decline of the language gave an added impetus to the work that the linguists did. People knew that what was not recorded would be lost for future generations. And finally, American foundations and agencies of the federal government were in a generous mood in the post-war period, and they were flush with cash. And so there were many funding opportunities for projects which would not have been possible before World War II, or for that matter today, as we see in the news. In some ways, then, the post-war America was a sort of little golden age for Yiddish studies. The YIVO Institute itself was not always directly involved in all of the projects of the members of the YIVO Linguistic Circle, mainly for financial reasons. But the spirit of YIVO was present, I think, even if the money came from elsewhere. Although the YIVO linguists were scholars first, not activists, they also worked to maintain Yiddish as a spoken language, especially through their work in education. In 1948, even before Uriel Weinreich was appointed the first Yiddish professor at Columbia University while he was still a graduate student there. YIVO published his textbook, College Yiddish. He was only 23 years old. It was the first modern Yiddish textbook and remained the standard work until just a few years ago. Even today, there are teachers who prefer it, and it remains a go-to reference grammar, I think. Publication of College Yiddish marked a major shift in Yiddish education. Before World War II, Yiddish was mainly taught in schools for children, either in Jewish day schools or, especially in the United States, in supplementary afternoon and Sunday schools. I'm leaving the Orthodox out of the discussion here, since although they often used Yiddish and still use Yiddish, they did not usually teach the language formally. The secular Yiddish schools gradually dropped their Yiddish, or they ceased to exist in the 1950s and 1960s, with a few happy exceptions. On the other hand, in the post-war period, a new frontier for Yiddish education opened at the college level, as young Jews flocked to the universities in record numbers. Teaching Yiddish at the college level probably peaked in the 1970s during the so-called ethnic revival, when Americans of all ethnic groups went looking for their roots. But even today, college Yiddish is still used in many colleges, in online courses, and in summer programs around the world, including, of course, YIVO's own summer program. Another effort of the YIVO linguist was what is called language planning. In fact, it seems that Uriel Weinreich himself coined the term language planning. It refers to efforts to standardize a language, to unify its spelling, to coin new words for things that did not exist before, to educate the public and to dispel myths and prejudices, to refine the language, so to speak, to decide which words are kosher and which words are treif. YIVO published a special magazine for these purposes called Yiddische Sprach, Yiddish language, which began to appear in 1941, and it sort of petered out in the early 1980s, so for about 40 years. One aspect of language planning at which the YIVO linguists largely succeeded was the standardization of Yiddish spelling. After extensive and heated debates, the YIVO philological section in Vilna adopted a standard orthography in 1936. Due to the war and to many other priorities, obviously, there was not much thought given to spelling until the post-war period. Only gradually, in the 1950s and 1960s, did many publications begin to adopt the standard spelling. The leading literary journal, for example, the Golden Ekate, which was published in Israel by Max Weinreich's friend and former student, Avram Sutzkever, fully adopted YIVO spelling only in 1961. The Vorwärts, once the most popular Yiddish newspaper, it opposed the YIVO spelling for about 60 years, but finally adopted it in 1998. And today, YIVO spelling is used throughout most of the secular Yiddish world, at least among those who have some formal education in the language. Now, another topic, the study of Yiddish dialects. Even before he helped found the YIVO a century ago, Max Weinreich had conducted some preliminary research on Yiddish dialects. He sent out a dialect questionnaire in 1923 and received several hundred replies, which have sadly been lost. I should say, dialects are very important for the study of Yiddish because dialects are the normal spoken language. The literary language has always been more unified, but in speech, especially informally and at home, almost everybody just spoke dialect. And that's still the case today. It was clear, however, even a century ago, that many specific regional features and words of the dialects were being lost due to modernization, as was also happening with many other languages. Greater urbanization, migration, improved communication, education, literacy, they lead everywhere to the gradual standardization of languages. And also the same was happening in Yiddish. However, Max Weinreich was too busy with YIVO and with other projects to continue his dialect research, so the work actually fell to his son, Uriel, about 30 years later. Partly with a dialect study in mind, Uriel Weinreich spent a year at the University of Zurich in Switzerland, familiarizing himself with the new methods in dialectology which were being practiced there. He began work on his own Language and Culture Atlas of Ashkenazic Jewry in 1959 during a sabbatical year in Jerusalem. After he obtained more funding for the project, he assembled a team of young linguists, including Mordechai Schechter, some of you may have heard of. And together they interviewed informants from some 600 different locations all across Europe, plus Jerusalem and Tzfat, where Yiddish dialects had been spoken. Many of these interviews lasted 15 hours with a questionnaire of 2,000 or 3,000 questions. So this is a lot of data that was gathered. And the answers were transcribed and organized in preparation for eventual analysis and mapping. Uriel was able to get funding for the project from a variety of American agencies and foundations, including the National Science Foundation and, remarkably, the National Institute of Mental Health. He even applied to the Department of Defense, arguing that Yiddish was necessary in order to win the Cold War, since many Soviet Jews spoke Yiddish. They didn't buy that argument, sadly. He developed an ambitious plan, probably ahead of his time, to computerize all the data using one of those giant IBM mainframe computers of that time, because he foresaw the possibility of automatic map making. The computer could make the map for you. Unfortunately, Uriel Weinreich died in 1967 at age 40, before the main part of the research was finished. And the rest of his team of linguists did not have the same genius and the same talent for getting funding, which is sometimes more important. And they carried on the work for another 30 years and eventually published 3 large atlas volumes, co-published by YIVO, by the way. Still, most of the data has never been analyzed, mapped, or published. Recently, in 2018, Columbia University Libraries scanned the answer sheets of the project, about 100,000 pages, and put them all online. Also, the original recordings of the interviews, about 5,000 hours, were redigitized and put online. And thanks to this new availability, there was a young linguist in Germany, Leah Schaffer. In recent years, she's published several articles and also books, important books, and hundreds of digital maps based on the atlas data. It's also worth mentioning another young linguist, Itzik Gottesman, who is a professor at Berkeley and who just received tenure a few weeks ago. He's working on a similar project, a corpus of Yiddish spoken in Europe, which is based on recordings of Holocaust testimonies. And Gottesman's corpus sort of complements the atlas data, because the people who were interviewed there were sort of belonged to a younger group. They were born shortly before the war in many cases. It's still a work in progress, but Gottesman has a team of transcribers who are working. But already he's created a sort of word map tool, which is basically an automatic map maker, probably of the sort that Uriel Weinreich was dreaming of in the 1960s. There are also other projects of dialect interviews that have been collected, for example, by David Katz, Litvaks, Dov Keller, of Ukrainian Jews, but those materials have not been processed yet in many cases. Okay, a second major project that was connected to YIVO, although it was not formally a YIVO project, was the Great Dictionary of the Yiddish Language. Since at least the Chernovitz Conference in 1908, there had been discussion of the need for a Yiddish academic dictionary of the sort that existed for other European languages, or what Eliezer Ben Yehuda was creating for Hebrew, for example. Several such efforts were unfortunately destroyed in World War II. There was a manuscript in the YIVO archive, YIVO collection in Vilna, which had been left by a pioneering Yiddish linguist, Alfred Landau. He died in 1935, and the manuscript went to YIVO, and then it was lost, unfortunately, in the ghetto. A second project, also in Minsk, for a Soviet Yiddish academic dictionary, also was lost in the Second World War. After the war, there was a new urgency in such discussions, since it was clear that much of the vocabulary that had been used in Europe would be forgotten. A new initiative to create an academic dictionary came from Nochem Stuchkov, a well-known figure from Yiddish radio, who was also a self-taught lexicographer. In 1950, YIVO published his Thesaurus of the Yiddish Language, edited by Max Weinreich, which was itself the largest collection of Yiddish words and phrases to date. Over the following years, Stuchkov assembled several other editors, and he worked out a deal with YIVO to begin work on an academic dictionary. YIVO did not want to finance the project, so a separate dictionary committee was created to raise funds and to manage the project. But YIVO assigned a space in its building to the dictionary staff, and it allowed free use of its library and archive. So for most of its history, the Great Dictionary was in YIVO, even if it was not of YIVO. The first conflict in the history of the project was among the editors over the scale of the dictionary. Should it be a large one-volume dictionary, like Webster's English Dictionary, for example, or should it be a truly comprehensive multi-volume historical dictionary with citations and etymologies, like the Oxford English Dictionary? Stoichkov wanted a one-volume dictionary, which he thought was manageable within about 5 years. Another editor, Judel Mark, wanted an Oxford-style dictionary, which would take much longer, obviously. For better or worse, Mark won that argument, and he determined the fate of the dictionary. In retrospect, Mark's plan was probably overly ambitious. The Yiddish public could not afford something like the Oxford English Dictionary, and most readers were too old to wait for something like that to be completed. But at the time, there were still 3 or 4 million Yiddish speakers in the world, and it didn't seem impossible. A second important conflict was over the spelling in the dictionary. Max Weinreich and the YIVO administration required that the dictionary follow the standard YIVO spelling, while Mark and the other editors wanted to make certain changes. Because neither side would compromise on the issue, the Great Dictionary was not published as an official YIVO publication. Eventually, Mark moved the project to Jerusalem, partly in the hope that Hebrew University would take responsibility for the project and ensure its continuation after his passing. Unfortunately, that didn't happen either. Despite his missteps, Mark deserved credit for organizing the project and writing and editing tens of thousands of entries over a period of 20 years. He recruited hundreds of volunteers to read through much of Yiddish literature pen in hand in search of new words and phrases to write out citations which would serve as the basis for the dictionary's entries. He even reached out to Orthodox Jews, tried to involve them. Chaim Lieberman, the secretary to the Lubavitcher Rebbe, contributed many thousands of citations from religious literature, more than any other volunteer. Mark was also very successful at fundraising from both private and public sources. He set up a so-called lexicographic institute at City College, which was really just a funding mechanism that enabled the dictionary to receive hundreds of thousands of dollars from the US government in US government grants. Even when he moved the project to Jerusalem in 1970, most of the money continued to come from the US government. Unfortunately, Mark did not live forever, and there was nobody after him with the same drive and productivity. He managed to publish 3 volumes and to edit a 4th volume, which appeared after his passing in 1975. Those 4 volumes, with about 80,000 entries, cover only the letter Aleph, the first letter of the Yiddish Aleph base. But Aleph is a very common letter, so actually it covers about a quarter of the total vocabulary. Mark's successors, mainly in Jerusalem, continued to work on volumes 5 and 6 throughout the 1980s. The 2 staff members deserve special mention, Shaul Ferdman and Yosef Guri, who wrote most of these new entries. Because of technical problems in transitioning the work onto computers, and because of a general lack of progress, the whole project was defunded by the NEH in 1989. All of their work was packed up into boxes and put away, and Ferdman and Guri never lived to see their work published. But there is some good news from 2 years ago. A Yiddish lexicographer from Ukraine, Dmytro Tishchenko, scanned the unedited manuscripts of volumes 5 and 6, about 20,000 typewritten pages, and he put them online. And this increases the number of entries available by about 50%. So even in its unfinished state, the Great Dictionary is an important resource for scholars, advanced students, and for anyone else who is able to read the definitions. There are tens of thousands of words there that are defined there, and there are nowhere else. Today, there are very few old-timers, obviously, whom you can ask about such words. As an aside, I'll mention that Justus van de Kamp in Amsterdam has been working for 35 years on a Yiddish-Dutch dictionary, and just a few weeks ago, he surpassed 100,000 entries, making it the most comprehensive bilingual Yiddish dictionary available in the world. It's a sort of It's a sort of great dictionary of its own, but only for people who speak Dutch. So you can see that having definitions in Yiddish is really not so bad. In conclusion, the YIVO linguists were amazingly productive, and they managed to document the pre-war language in great detail, and tens of thousands of dictionary entries, and thousands of hours of interviews, in 100,000 pages of data. A problem for later scholars is really how to make good use of this huge amount of data. But that is actually a good problem to have. It's better too much data than too little. And there are many other groups, including other Jewish groups and other Jewish languages, that have not been so lucky. Maybe this is the problem that artificial intelligence can solve. In any case, YIVO linguists have left us today with a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Leyzer. I don't know if you can hear me, but I hope you stay tuned because we're going to get back to you when we discuss and have questions later. So I am going to introduce Mark Smith now, before we hear his paper. Mark Smith is the author most recently of Building and Consoling a Nation, the Yiddish Historians in Their Own Words. Oh, actually that's forthcoming this year. And his paper today is titled YIVO and the Creation of Holocaust Studies.
Hello to everyone at YIVO. On the occasion of YIVO's 100th anniversary, I apologize for speaking by video, but I have the honor of observing one slightly older anniversary each day. My mother is Kanenahara, 106 years old, and I am the person she relies on for care. So please excuse me for speaking from here in Los Angeles. The topic I was asked to address, YIVO and the Creation of Holocaust Studies, is interesting in itself, but also because it expresses a contradiction. YIVO on the one hand, Holocaust on the other. Even before the well-known appeal by Salo Baron in 1928 to, quote, break with the lachrymose theory of Jewish history, the culture and attitude of YIVO had already been set in a positive direction. YIVO's subject was and remained Jewish life, not Jewish suffering or death. In all the journals published by YIVO before World War II, the Historische, Ökonomische, and Philologische Schriften, as well as the YIVO Blätter itself, articles on anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish legislation, and attacks on Jews are exceptionally rare. As for books, I know of only one that was published by YIVO before the Holocaust on the subject of Jewish catastrophe, the 1938 edition of Nossen Hanover's Chronicle of the Chmielnicki pogroms introduced by historian Yankov Shatsky. And I know of only one such book after the Holocaust, aside from books on the Holocaust itself, namely the 1965 posthumous volume by historian Elias Cherikover on the pogroms of 1919. This anti-lachrymose view influenced YIVO's approach to Holocaust studies in two ways. The first was that YIVO did not allow its original mission to be overtaken or subverted by the imperative of Holocaust research. Whether this was deliberate or a natural outcome of its pre-war culture, I have not discovered. But the result is that although YIVO made significant contributions to Holocaust research, only 2 volumes of the post-war studies published in this series of YIVO Blätter were devoted entirely to the Holocaust. And in YIVO's total published output from that time to the present, Holocaust topics occupy only a small fraction of the space. The second manifestation of YIVO's anti-lachrymose orientation was that although YIVO was among the first Jewish institutions to study the Holocaust, YIVO-affiliated scholars turned to Holocaust studies with the same approach they had applied to previous periods of Jewish history. Contrary to other early centers of Holocaust research, most YIVO scholars did not concentrate on death and destruction, or even on Jewish heroism or German crimes. Instead, YIVO scholars studied the Holocaust as the latest, albeit most frightful period of Jewish history, and focused on Jewish life under German domination and the struggle to sustain it, relying wherever possible on Jewish sources of information, as they had before the war. YIVO's role in the creation of Holocaust studies encompassed three phases: contemporaneous reportage during wartime, immediate post-war collecting and publishing of primary sources, and following a period of research and gathering of forces, sustained production of scholarly works. After the Germans invaded Poland in September 1939, YIVO rescued its operations by relocating to New York, but retained its focus on Eastern Europe. When the Germans forced the Jews of Warsaw into the now famous Warsaw Ghetto the following October, a map of the ghetto appeared immediately in the November-December issue of the YIVO Blätter. Lucy Davidovich recalls in her memoir that, as assistant to editor Max Weinreich, it was she who drew the heavy black line of the ghetto onto the street map. By early 1942, enough information had been gathered for the well-known Yiddish educator and writer Shlomo Mendelssohn to publish an extended article in the YIVO Blätter titled "How the Polish Jews Live in the Ghettos." YIVO's focus on the Jews rather than the Germans appears in such chapter headings as population density, health conditions, food provisions, earning a living, schools, organization of Jewish life, refugees, communications, Jewish cultural work, and underground work. All of these would become principal topics of Holocaust research for YIVO-affiliated scholars in the years to come. By the end of the war, YIVO was engaged in an intense effort to gather information about the recent catastrophe. Such information took two forms: documentary materials and personal accounts. In the documentary field, YIVO was fortunate to receive collections from the three principal ghettos of occupied Poland. From the Warsaw Ghetto, YIVO received the Hirsch-Wasser collection. As one of the few survivors of Emanuel Ringelblum's secret Einig Shabbos project, Wasser was able to preserve not only duplicates of documents now in the Ringelblum archive at the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw, but many other documents that are held only by YIVO. From the Vilna Ghetto, YIVO received the Avrom Sutzkever and Shmerke Kaczerginski collection. Both of these well-known pre-war poets were leaders of the famed Paper Brigade that rescued Jewish historical treasures from the YIVO collections under the eyes of the German authorities in Vilna, to which they added a rich collection of materials on Jewish life in the Vilna Ghetto. And from the Lodz Ghetto, YIVO received the Nachman Zonabend collection. Following the mass deportations of Jews from the ghetto, Zonabend was one of the few remaining who were ordered by the Germans to pack and ship Jewish property. Secretly and in haste, he hid or buried documents that he was able to retrieve immediately after the war. Each of these ghetto collections includes official records and publications of the Judenrat, the imposed Jewish governing council, together with personal materials on aspects of daily life, such as diaries, letters, photos, and literary works. Additional materials were collected directly by YIVO in New York and by its branches in Great Britain, Australia, Israel, and elsewhere during the late 1940s and 50s. YIVO's second principal effort after the war was to conduct or acquire eyewitness accounts. YIVO personnel interviewed survivors in the displaced persons camps in Europe immediately after the war. Further interviews were acquired from other organizations, and YIVO continued to conduct survivor interviews in New York from the 1960s onward. At one time, it was common for scholars and staff to encourage survivors whom they met or knew to let YIVO record their experiences. Today, the online finding aid indicates that YIVO has more than 2,000 eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust. In the first post-war years, Holocaust research was limited by access to relevant sources, and publishing archival materials was a first step towards scholarly work. This early concentration on primary sources is reflected in Volume 30 of the YIVO Blätter, published in late 1947. The volume was titled The Jahren von Umkunft, The Years of Catastrophe. Its contents include first-person accounts of events in the ghettos and camps, Zelig Kamenovich's now famous essay, The Spirit of the Ghetto, maps of camps and ghettos, reviews of dozens of books on the Holocaust, and reproductions of original documents from the ghettos. Following this came the turn from collecting to scholarship, as reflected in the only other post-war volume of the YIVO Blätter devoted exclusively to the Holocaust, Volume 37, published in 1953, titled Die Tekufa von letzten Juden, The Period of the Recent Destruction. There is only one entry that could be described as a primary source, a Yiddish translation of Zelig Kalmanovich's Hebrew diary from the Vilna ghetto. All the rest are research articles by leading early Holocaust historians, including Philip Friedman, Yeshaya Trunk, Yosef Kermish, and Leon Polyakov, among others. Even the articles on German topics were based largely on Jewish sources. An example is Trunk's article, Epidemics as a Weapon in the German Extermination Plan, which draws almost exclusively on materials from the Ringelblum archive, records of the Jewish self-help in the Warsaw Ghetto, official publications of the Judenrat, notes by Jewish doctors and nurses, and eyewitness accounts. Many of the articles had been previewed at YIVO's annual conference in January 1953, which commemorated the 10th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and was attended by 2,000 members and guests. All the articles also appeared in English translation that year as Volume 8 of the YIVO Annual of Jewish Social Science. The following year, in January 1954, YIVO signed a landmark agreement with Yad Vashem for their joint documentary project. It was funded by the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany, which provided essential support to both institutions during that period. The principal project was a series of bibliographies of Holocaust writings that appeared in 12 volumes from 1960 to 1975. 5 in Hebrew, 3 in Yiddish, 2 in English, 1 in Hungarian, and 1 multilingual introductory volume, the well-known Guide to Jewish History Under Nazi Impact by Jacob Robinson and Philip Friedman. This and the 3 Yiddish volumes were prepared by YIVO under Friedman's direction in New York, primarily on the basis of YIVO's holdings. Of the Yiddish volumes, 1 was devoted to books in Yiddish, and 1 each to articles in Yiddish periodicals published in Europe and America. Despite the recent growth of digital resources, these volumes remain the essential starting point for research on early writings about the Holocaust. The other notable outcome of the joint documentary project was the first and apparently only volume of a projected series of monographs. This was Isaiah Trunk's History of the Lodz Ghetto, published in Yiddish as Ghetto Lodz by YIVO in 1964, and based heavily on materials in the YIVO archives. Its success in Yiddish, but relative obscurity outside of Yiddish circles, resulted in the much-praised English translation by Robert Moses Shapiro that appeared in 2006. One of Philip Friedman's major projects, for which he had been collecting materials before his premature death in 1960, was a wide-ranging history of the Judenrat. During his lifetime, he had published articles on the leaders of the Warsaw Ghetto and Vilna Ghetto Jewish councils. His colleague, Isaiah Trunk, who had been researching the same subject since the mid-1940s, took up the project and completed it in 1972 with his monumental work, Judenrat, the Jewish councils in Eastern Europe under Nazi occupation. Written in Yiddish, but published in English, it received the National Book Award for History. By way of context, the only other work of Jewish history that has received a National Book Award is World of Our Fathers by Irving Howe, published 4 years later. Trunk produced one further work that relied almost entirely on sources from the YIVO archives, his 1979 book, Jewish Responses to Nazi Persecution. As he emphasized in the preface, it focuses on, quote, the day-to-day life and struggle of the Jewish victims, and after an introductory essay, consists of excerpts from 62 eyewitness testimonies from the YIVO archives. In 1967, YIVO convened an international colloquium on the Judenrat, chaired by Max Weinreich, at which leading Holocaust historians presented and debated their ideas. Some of the figures best known today include Trunk and Robinson from the U.S., and Nachman Blumenthal, Shaul Esch, and Natan Eck from Israel. The complete papers and discussions were published by YIVO in a bilingual Yiddish and English volume in 1972, titled Imposed Jewish Governing Bodies Under Nazi Rule. This, too, remains an essential source on the range of views, many speculative or based on isolated data, that preceded Trunk's authoritative study. The other well-known historian of the Holocaust, who relied notably on the YIVO collections, was Lucy Davidovich. Her 1975 book, The War Against the Jews, is the only work of the post-war era to draw to a comparable extent on YIVO resources, and it is written from the same internal Jewish perspective as works by the other YIVO-affiliated historians. she mentions specifically her reliance on YIVO's 3 ghetto collections donated by Wasser, Sutzkever and Kaczerginski, and Zonabend. And now, for those who have been thinking with growing impatience, what about? Indeed, what about Max Weinreich's pioneering book, Hitler's Professors, published by YIVO in Yiddish in 1946 in the YIVO Blätter and then as a volume itself, and in English translation in 1947 with a second English edition in 1995. His study uncovers the scholars and professionals who helped to justify Nazi racial policy and invent more efficient means of murder. It is based to a significant degree on materials in the YIVO archives, yet it is decidedly lachrymose in tone. It focuses more on the Germans than the Jews and is based primarily on German sources, refuting all that I have said about the contradictory nature of YIVO and the study of the Holocaust. It is an example of the hazards of generalizing about historical events, as I have attempted to do. But then, of course, it is unique, both among Weinreich's writings and among YIVO's Holocaust publications. Next, an observation. Thinking about YIVO's archival holdings and the contribution made by YIVO to Holocaust research led to noticing a contrast between the 2 leading YIVO-affiliated Holocaust historians, Philip Friedman and Isaiah Trunk. Both relied heavily on archival sources in their earlier years in Poland. But Friedman changed his method on coming to America. His many important articles and essays rely almost exclusively on published sources, and notably, he produced no book-length monographs. His work at YIVO as head of the Historians Circle and of the Joint Bibliography Project with Yad Vashem placed him, one might say, at the front of the house. But to quote the British historian Maitland on his mentor Lord Acton, it could also be said of Trunk that he was, quote, at home, no doubt, upon the front stairs, but supreme upon the back stairs. For Trunk, the back stairs led to the YIVO collections, where he was first employed as archivist, then for many years as chief archivist. He relied on the YIVO collections to produce historical studies that fulfilled the demand voiced so often by pre-war YIVO scholars for works written auf den Smach von archivalische Quellen mit an Apparat, on the basis of archival sources with a scholarly apparatus of citations and commentary. And finally, a personal note. Speaking as someone who has benefited from decades of hurried visits to YIVO's collections, and more recently from unlimited access to these materials online, the promise of YIVO's digitization project, particularly for research on the Holocaust era, is a welcome joining of these front-of-house and back-of-house areas of knowledge. Congratulations to YIVO on this centennial year, and thank you all for your attention.
Our next speaker today is Itzik Gottesman. Itzik is the visiting scholar in the Department of Germanic Studies and the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. And we all know and love his important work defining the Yiddish nation, the Jewish folklorists of Poland. But right now, he's most engaged in his popular blog called Yiddish Song of the Week. So you should check that out. The paper is called YIVO and Folklore in the Post-Holocaust Years.
Okay. Thank you, Alyssa. Thank you to YIVO. I remember it was great to see all these people from the 1980s when I worked for 5 years as an archivist. And where I sat and did my archival work, there now hangs a $19 million Klimt painting. Before we look at YIVO and folklore after the Holocaust, we have to briefly mention the beginnings of the YIVO Ethnographic Commission, which ceased its work when the war began. The YIVO Ethnographic Committee, as it was known before changing its name to the YIVO Commission, was part of YIVO from the very beginning in 1925 in Vilna. Though it was subsumed under the philological section, It became the most popular YIVO section with hundreds of Sammlers, collectors, sending in materials from 140 towns and cities from all over the world. YIVO placed a special importance on folklore. In an English-language brochure from 1929, the American branch, the Amoptale, listed the collecting of folklore as one of 3 fundamental aims of the Institute, quote, to rescue from oblivion the products of the collective soul of our people, Jewish folklore. These materials included Yiddish, folk songs, folk tales, especially those, but also jokes, legends, Purimspielen, folk beliefs, such as charms and folk remedies. To obtain this folklore, YIVO from the very beginning sent out questionnaires, enquêtes, to the Sammlers. These questionnaires were short and only included 4 or 5 examples of what was wanted. Some were on the observance of holidays, one was of Jewish traditions on Christmas, others on custom, such as the Upscherenish, cutting the male child's hair at the age of 3. The first enquête, dated December 1925, inquired about local legends. For those in the Vilna area, they mentioned legends about the Vilna Gaon. For those in the Ukraine, they were advised to ask about the legends of the Ludmila Moed. In Congress Poland, they were to be on the lookout for legends about the Polish uprising of 1863. In eastern Galicia, there were legends about Carmelin, the richest man in town who during a storm would not let go of his treasure of gold and drowned. I have to say that this legend of Carmelin was written about in my grandmother's memoirs, that this actually happened in her town. But that is the nature of a legend. Right? A legend is a story that is told to be believed. And so I was shocked when I saw that it was in the questionnaire of YIVO and not my grandmother's original story. The method of collecting folklore was in contrast to the folklore expeditions of S. Ansky from 1912 to 1914, in which Ansky and his team traveled from shtetl to shtetl, collecting and recording folk materials. They did use questionnaires at some point, but it was always the folklorist who marked down what was said or sung. The Sammlers had done such a fine job of collecting, the YIVO Sammlers had done such a fine job of collecting and sending what they had written down to Vilna, in the YIVO in Vilna, that by 1930, YIVO received 100,000 folklore items. Some of these materials can be found today in the collection of the YIVO Ethnographic Commission. They survived because in 1942 they were moved by the Nazis from Vilna to Frankfurt, and from Frankfurt they were repatriated to the YIVO now in New York. After a visit to the Vilna YIVO in 1930 by the eminent Yiddish folklorist I.L. Kahn, the emphasis of the YIVO Folklore Commission gradually changed from the collection of materials to the training of younger scholars. This goal was already stated in the original program of YIVO. To this end, YIVO established the Aspirantur, an advanced research program not just for folklore but for other sections as well. The established scholars Max Weinreich, Zalman Rezen, and Zeli Kamenovich were to supervise the research projects of the aspiranten. I.L. Kahn, who lived in New York, was a folklore supervisor from afar. By 1935, the first of the aspiranten began their work. In the field of folklore, there were 2, Nechama Epstein, who specialized in Yiddish jokes and humor, and Shmuel Zanvil Pippe, who specialized in Yiddish folk songs, children's games. They both perished in the Holocaust, but both had published excellent essays on their subjects in the late 1930s. The high point of the pre-Holocaust Sammelarbeit at YIVO was the volume Yiddische Folklore, published in 1938, and edited before his death in 1937 by I.L. Kahn, with the assistance of Epstein and Pippe. The volume was conceived of as an ode to the YIVO Sammlers, subtitling it the 5th volume of the YIVO Philologische Schriften. It listed all the places from which folklore materials had been sent to YIVO. The YIVO Folklore Commission was not the only pre-war contributions to Yiddish folklore. In the YIVO series Philologische Schriften, the 3 large format volumes that were printed in Vilna, 1926, 29, and 30, they contain much folklore. In Volume 2 and 3, there are enough folklore studies to form its own section in the volume. In Volume 1, also called the Landeubuch, there are articles about proverbs, the evil spirit Landtuch, and a pioneering study by Yud Lamed Khan on folk song. In the 1930 periodical YIVO Blätter, which began appearing in 1931, YIVO Blätter's folklore articles were not just collections of folklore, but the only venue at that time where YIVO-associated scholars could review books, react to international research and scholarship, and give the aspiranten their first publications. In 1936, Pippe published his articles on Yiddish Kinderspielen, children's games, and 2 collections of Galiciana Yiddish folk songs, together with his brother Oyzer. The developing of a new Yiddish generation of Yiddish folklore scholars in Vilna thanks to the aspirantur, was abruptly closed with the Holocaust. Thanks in large part to Max Weinreich, YIVO was reestablished in New York during the war, incorporating the American section, the Amabteil, of YIVO. Though Max Weinreich has rightly been thought of as mainly a linguist, his work and research on Yiddish folklore is substantial, especially as an editor. One need only read the footnotes of his history of the Yiddish language to see that. When YIVO moved to New York, the folk that provided the folklore was largely gone, but scholarship and fieldwork continued. As early as the mid-1940s, YIVO asked people in the displaced person camps, DP camps, to collect in the camps and to send in folklore materials to the Yiddish headquarters. My own mother and uncle were doing Zammel work collecting in the DP camp of Vienna, collecting Yiddish children's rhymes and folktales and sending them to the headquarters in New York. A crucial moment in the rebirth of Yiddish folklore at YIVO was a course on folklore and folk literature at UCLA in the summer of 1948, taught by Max Weinreich. Among the young participants were future Yiddish folklore collectors and scholars Beatrice Silverman, who soon to be married to Odile Weinreich, so we're going to have 3 Weinreichs now, who was also a panel in the UCLA seminar. Chana, or Eleanor Malotic, who would later become Max Weinreich's secretary and become the music and theater archivist at YIVO, married another seminar participant, Yossel Malotic. Most of the seminar group were able to participate thanks to fellowships. These students were so inspired by the seminar that Max Weinreich led that in 1948, when they returned to New York from LA, they published 3 issues of a journal in Yiddish called Yiddische Folklore, one of the finest achievements for folklore studies in Yiddish in post-war YIVO. The first project the Folklore Club did, and they called themselves a club, after their return to New York, was to send out a questionnaire on Passover. Part of the results were included in Beatrice Weinreich's article, The Americanization of Passover, comparing the Old World Passover Seder to the American Seder. For example, the search for chametz with a candle and feather in the Old World was replaced in America with the search using a flashlight. Celebrating Passover at home in the shtetl was replaced by a trip to Miami Hotel for the entire 8 days of Yontif, where all cooking was done by hired workers. Why pay the tailor to make a new suit for Passover when you can go shopping and bring a suit home in one afternoon? Round or oval matzahs became square in shape in the late 19th, early 20th century. In America, it has become a sort of tradition to invite non-Jews to the Seder, but in the Old World, this was never done. In this article, Bina Weinreich used the method of questionnaires quite effectively, though the editors claimed that collection was no longer the object, that collection of folklore was no longer the object of the club. More important was to study the methods of folklore theory. In the first issue of Yiddish Folklore, published in January 1954, the club acknowledges that since the Holocaust, there has been no larger collections of Yiddish folklore printed. Most of the Vilna collections were destroyed. But in an optimistic tone, the editors write that nevertheless, the folklore work would continue, and it did. Over the previous years, since the end of the war, a large folklore collection had accumulated. Some sent to YIVO from Sammlers who remembered the pre-war years and the Sammler system. The editors welcomed these materials and would print them in the journal. But the editors write, quote, "We maintain that the Yiddish folklore researcher cannot be satisfied with all the materials that were printed until 1940. In other words, continue printing. In this first issue are represented only a small number of Sammlers, especially those who are associated with the Kahn Club. But we hope this journal will help us connect with a larger circle of collectors." The introduction also calls for the Sammlers to send in any variants they have of a song or story, and not to be dissatisfied when they see some similar version already in print. This emphasis on variants is a break with the approach of Yud Lamed Khan. Khan wanted the world to see what he considered the best that Yiddish folklore had to offer, and therefore he combined versions of the same tale or song. If a Sammler sent in only a fragment, just one verse to a song or no logical ending to a tale, Khan would edit it before publication. The folklore club members asked for folklore no matter what shape. Comparing the variants could reflect the history of the song, where and when it originated. This was new in Yiddish folklore research, except for Przeludzki's collections in Warsaw. The editors also expressed an interest in collecting not just from informants, but also from local daily newspapers or journals or printed memoirs. The material did not have to come from a living informant. This was another aspect in which the club did not follow the approach of the Vilna Ethnographische Kommissie. And as a conclusion, the editors write, quote, "But one thing is clear. The responsibility to collect the raw material is imperative. Research and popularizations can wait, and so we restrict ourselves to collect raw material and postpone scholarly approaches and popularizations for later." So they expressed both sides of the coin, both scholarship and collecting, but they did both. The emerging folklore scholars from the YIVO Folklore Club were Uriel Weinreich, Beatrice Silverman Weinreich, and Chana Molotek. They would go on to write important works and to continue the collecting of Yiddish folklore, especially Silverman Weinreich and Molotek. Their widening of the folklore genres to be collected was important and needed. Quote, this is the club speaking, "On the other hand, we do not limit the genres of this raw material to folktales, songs, and proverbs, but include also customs and folk art, especially since there is not, at the moment, any separate ethnographic publication for them." End quote. Another break with the tradition of Yiddish folklore was the inclusion of materials that he considered borderline folklore, or in his expression, halb folklorische und Sophic folklorische Schaffungen. And by this he meant Badchonis, the declamations of the Badchen, Hasidic Nigunim, folklorized art and theater songs. Khan did not appreciate the Badchen and his wedding rhymes. In his opinion, in his view, there was babbling and bad poetry. The editors of Yiddish folklore believe differently, that it's not a question of folklorischkeit, yes, folklore, no folklore, but an issue of degree. And since no one is championing or defending the halb folkloric creations, let us in this journal defend them. The editors presented a long list of what to collect, and most of the genres are not surprising. Songs with melodies written down, jokes, proverbs, omens, folk remedies. The list, though, also includes genres that were not included in the pre-war YIVO list. Jewish baking recipes, Jewish food, dancing, folk art, joke books, even old records, like 78 records. If it's just a fragment, send it anyway. They wrote. In this first issue of Bina Weinreich showed herself to be a skillful collector. Chana Molotek proved to be a skillful researcher and gave exhaustive annotations for each song. Molotek's expertise at finding parallels and variants before the age of computers was extraordinary. Her memory of having seen a song before in this or that archive was also incredible. I worked with her in the archives for 5 years, and her memory for songs in the YIVO archives, not just folk songs, but theater and art songs, was unmatched. Her analyses were so thorough that little could be added to her annotations done 20 to 30 years later. The Kahn Folklore Club was able to enjoy the benefits of earlier collectors in America who had donated their Yiddish materials to the American YIVO, the Amabtel. One of these folklorists was Aleph Litvin, best known for his 6-volume Yiddish Neshamas, detailing his travels through Eastern Europe before the First World War. With a keen ethnographic eye, Litvin was a great storyteller and collector, and his papers at YIVO contain tales, songs, and proverbs which were used in various YIVO exhibitions and publications over the years. Early attempts at finding an American Yiddish folklore were desired, but by the YIVO Club were desired but difficult. Bina Weinreich had collected games and rhymes of Jewish children in the streets of New York and suggested that expressions such as gee whiz or jeepers creepers were expressions created by Jewish children to replace the exclamation Jesus Christ. Right? Jeepers creepers, Jesus Christ, gee whiz, Jesus. Okay. Anybody know anything about that? I don't know. I didn't look that up. Anyway, they were trying to find an American Yiddish folklore. Uriel Weinreich, the well-known Yiddish linguist, put together a collection of geographic names, a folklore genre that was popular with the pre-war folklorists Shmuel Lehman and Noach Prolitsky. Here one can read about, quote, the Bialystoker Kuchenfressers, or the Warszawa Ganovim. Uriel Weinreich collected these and arranged the nicknames geographically on a map. Unlike the Prolitsky-Lehman collections of this genre, which rarely gave any additional information on why the inhabitants of these towns had these nicknames, it's not obvious that when you say a Bialystoker Kuchenfresser, why they were. I mean, do they ate more kuchen? I don't. So there was no additional comment on it. Though a Batchen's rhymed drinking song from Pinsk would have been rejected by Kahn, Uriel Weinreich, the linguist, looked at it poetically and broke down its dialectical features. Chana Molotek announced in the journal that she is preparing an index to published Yiddish folk songs. This plan never became a reality, but certainly inspired her to assemble the popular songbooks that she and her husband Yosem Molotek, who was also at the seminar in Los Angeles, 3 volumes, Mitrogen Gesang, Perl von Jiddischen Lied, and Songs of Generations. In the second issue of Yiddish Folklore that came out in June 1955, it became clear that the first issue was a great success and folklore materials came pouring in. Among the contributors were writers such as Mendel Elkin and Yermia Hescheles. Some names of contributors and singers were the same names that Kahn had recorded in the 1920s. This second issue was not offset printed as the first, but financed by YIVO. It seems it was among the most successful YIVO projects at the time. Among the YIVO Folklore Club participants was Label Kahn, also, I don't think he was in LA, but he was part of the club, who had a tape recorder, and in 1954 recorded 90 songs sung by Lifsha Schachter Widman as an assignment for the club. Several of these songs appeared in the 3 issues of Yiddish Folklore, but more importantly, they are listened to today by younger singers who want to learn the older tradition of Yiddish folk singers. An example of how the materials recorded by YIVO 60 years ago can have a new life and still teach us new old things about shtetl life through folk song. In addition to being the music archivist, Chana and Yosem Molotek started a wildly successful weekly column in the Yiddish Vorwärts newspaper, Lene der Monen sich Lieder, Readers Remember Songs, starting in 1970. Readers would send in a line or two of a song they had once known and ask the Moloteks to complete it or identify it. More often than not, the Moloteks would indeed identify the composer or poet and complete the song. This close connection between the folklorist Chana Molotek and their contributors was always very close, beginning with the YIVO journal, Yiddish Folklore. In addition to the Yiddish Folklore journal, independent scholars associated with YIVO had monographs connected to folklore and folk life. Among them was Yitzhak Rivkin's The Fight Against Gambling Among Jews, published in 1946 by YIVO, opens by saying that the Yiddish songs about gamblers and gambling is what inspired him to write the work. Rivkin's next work, also connected to Eastern European Jewish life, also published by YIVO, was Yiddish Geld, published in 1959. Other YIVO studies of folk life was Mordechai Kosova's Yiddish Mecholim, Jewish Foods, published in 1958, which originally was published in YIVO Blatt. Yeah. Though we think of Yiddish collections and projects as pre-war or post-war, There are collections that span both. After he arrived in America, Max Weinreich published I.L. Kahn's collected manuscripts in the YIVO archives from the 1920s and 1930s. Did I press something? No? Okay, well, that's YIVO. Many of his articles, such as Folk Song and Folksy Song, Folkstimlach, can still be considered relevant today. The most moving of the chapters are Kahn's letters from New York to YIVO's aspirant, Pippe, who was in Vilna in the 1930s. Kahn teaches his protege about folk song theory and the differences in the various songs that Pippe is accumulating in YIVO. There are even moments when the younger protege has a deeper understanding of the songs than his mentor. Max Weinreich also edited an important reissue of Kahn's folk song collections entitled Jiddische Volkslieder mit Melodies, a YIVO publication 1957, 500 pages. This is not only had the song text and melodies, this book not only had the song text and melodies, but also the names of the singers and where they came from. It's required reading for any folk song scholar. Though the Holocaust briefly mentioned most YIVO activities, some important folklore studies did not stop publication through the years. YIVO Blätter continued publishing during the war years, but not in Vilna. In New York, thanks to the Society of Friends of the YIVO Scientific Institute, the American branch, it was able to be continued. Articles on folklore, folk life, such as rural Jewish occupations in Lithuania by Hirsch Abramovich and Purim plays and clowns in the ghetto of Amsterdam by Jacob Schatzky, appeared in the publication. The journal YIVO Blätter was joined by a second Yiddish journal, Jiddische Sprach, edited for decades by Judel Mark. If one were to count the number of proverbs and local expressions printed in Jiddische Sprach, it would be in the thousands. Some contributors, such as Chaim Cheskin, then, when I spoke to him living in Brooklyn, started contributing folklore to the New York YIVO, the Vilna YIVO in the 1920s. I'm going to skip to the end here. Beatrice Silverman Weinreich, who could be certainly, even though it was anonymous, was a co-editor of the journal Jiddische Folklore, edited a volume of Yiddish folktales published by YIVO and Pantheon Books in 1988. Most of the tales printed were from the YIVO archives and had never been published before. It joined 16 other folktale collections in translation from various languages for the Pantheon Fairy and Folklore Library. In the field of Yiddish folk music recordings, YIVO's Sound Archive is world known for its 3 collections, the Ben Stonehill Collection, the Ruth Rubin Archive, and the YIVO Folk Song Project, East European Folk Song in its social context. The story of the Ben Stonehill Collection is well known, how he took a tape recorder in 1948 to an Upper West Side hotel where displaced persons, Jewish, were arriving. He stopped any Jews who walked by and asked them to sing a song. The result, a collection of 1,000 songs in various languages, but mainly Yiddish. What makes Stonehill's collection unique is the spontaneity of the singers, and as a result, the recordings cover a wide range of songs and singers. The Ruth Rubin Archive consists of her recordings of Yiddish singers beginning in the 1940s in America, where Rubin more often than not sought out good singers and recorded them. As a result, I believe you will rarely hear a bad singer, bad, in quotation marks, a bad singer in the Ruth Rubin Archive. The YIVO Folk Song Project, East European Folk Song in its social context, initiated and directed by Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett, 1973 to 75, recorded 320 hours of tape and 2,000 songs. This project was a response to song collections that were only interested in the song itself, but revealed little about the singer and his or her world, and how the song fit into the life of the singers. Barbara Kirschenblatt Gimblett created a 6-page questionnaire in Yiddish and English, which the field worker would ask for every song, and included such questions as, what is the first line? Are there parts of this song you don't sing? Why forget? Did you change the words? Why? When did you hear it for the first time? Did everyone sing this song, or just certain people? Who? Women, Hasidim, others? These questions were asked after every song. Only recently has the collection been digitized and put up on the YIVO website. These three recording collections taken up together comprise an unmatched importance in the research of Yiddish song. As you can see, YIVO in America has folklore resources that no one else has. This is no secret, and researchers and scholars have been coming constantly to study the materials on a regular basis. With digitization and cataloging, the materials are more accessible than ever. If you have some free time, listen to the Ruth Rubin archive and pick any song. You won't be disappointed. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, three very wonderful papers. I want to invite Itzik up to the stage so we could take some of your questions and start a conversation about what we just heard. And we're going to have Leyzer come up, right? Oh, terrific. So as we wait for Leyzer to join us, does anyone have any questions, or should we get started with a question first? No questions? Oh, Kalman. Okay.
This is really a conversation, but I'm really interested as someone who was present through much of what you were talking about in the latter period of your discussion. Why, in your view, did research about Yiddish folklore decline so much after the 1970s? Obviously, some of the fewer people to interview, but there are people still to interview.
Why did the process of interviewing decline?
Of collecting in general, that is, the last collection you mentioned was BKG's collection.
73 to 75.
Yeah, and the gap since then, you could sort of fill in the picture. I mean, you yourself are a folklorist, and
Right.
you worked on pre-war stuff.
Right. Well, I mean, I have an archive of 700 tapes of recordings, mainly folklore recordings. But I think that Barbara's project, and it was just digitized last year. I think that was the last major project.
Itzik, so you're a Zummler too? Is that what you mean by recordings? What's the nature of the recordings?
Well, if I know that they can sing, or I just ask folk life, just growing up. And I have my special interests, weird customs that people that I'd like to know more about. No one ever reads about when you read about the shtetl. So I think that's,
That's
I collect people sitting around a table speaking Yiddish, because who knows it,
So you just press record, and you just
When I'm smart,
That sounds worse than it
in my smarter moments, I just press record. When I want to ruin it, I say something.
I don't know how you feel about, encountering all of these different lenses on the big picture that you've also you're contributing to. Oh, hi, Leyzer. Can you hear us? And Leyzer, I'm not sure where because you're considerably younger, so I was going to just ask more of a reflective question, or just a reflection, really, about how I would have appreciated knowing about all these dimensions when I was a Zoomer program student, as we have with us today, because it's really it's quite an amazing big picture. It's like learn Yiddish and then choose your own adventure, I think, because there's so many different pathways into the archives, and so much to discover.
I mean, what's interesting about folklore is it's such a small field, but it's inspired so many, and it's something people can relate to, and that's part. In Vilna even, why were so many people sending in materials? What, you know, what was going on there psychologically, or, you know, I have my own interpretations.
Yeah,
but,
well, your
well, I think
interpretation is important.
it was a time when generations were separating, where the generation gap was big, and with folklore you could connect to your parents or grandparents without being religious, and I thought that was important. And
Right. If you weren't going to, let's say, follow your grandfather or your father to shul, you could connect with them on a different way, in a more maybe semi-academic way or scholarly way.
or singing, or you know,
Right. Even a cultural
or
way
stories.
that was framed
Yeah.
differently.
So I think that's one of the reasons. Maybe other people have other reasons.
Leyzer, I'm not sure if you heard the other talks.
Oh, yeah, I heard.
wonderful.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome to weigh in on the conversation now at any time.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on folklore, but definitely, I don't know, folklore, it has sort of an old-timey ring to it. So I don't know what they call it, ethnography, or what they make up new names to refer to it. So maybe the subject of folklore itself is not as popular as it used to be. But I mean, certainly folklore still exists and is still waiting for people to research it. And I mean, if you listen to a Hasidim talk, it's whatever this rabbi did and that rabbi did, and it's miracles are happening left and right. So there's lots of folklore happening, and I don't know if anyone's looking at it. and there's new music and new things happening. It's certainly worth examining.
Leyzer, were they drawing on the folklore? You said there was an overlap among some linguists were looking at folkloric material in order to define words.
Yeah, it was very interesting to listen to Itzik, because he's mentioning the same people that I mentioned, and of course there is some overlap because folklore was part of this old subject of philology, which covered literature, language. That was sort of the 19th century view of national culture. So these old-timey linguists that were also interested in folklore and in music, and they all sort of dabbled in different subjects. And for example, I talked about like the language and culture atlas of course, the language and culture. So there's all this culture, and there's music, there's songs that people are singing, and they ask about different customs. I don't know if anyone's actually looked at that aspect of those materials. That's 5,000 hours of people talking, and it's there's a lot of folklore in there.
Oh, great. Oh, we have a question.
I have two questions. Okay. Mostly for Itzik, but Leyzer, also please weigh in. Having seen RG 1.2, the YIVO ethnographic collection firsthand, there's a ton of really small slips from Zomlers where they submitted their material, including like jokes and sayings and stories and slang. So my question relates to that is, how did scholars, sort through that and make sense of it, and or what could scholars do in the future that hasn't been done, or how much has that material been put to use? And my second question is, how much scholarly work has been done on minhagim and customs in, all across the Stadtlach of Eastern Europe, both in terms of religious practices, maybe even in synagogue, and also from at the border of religion and superstition for things like how people would cut their nails.
To the second point, Nathaniel Deutsch is putting together like a online digital base for customs, for Jewish customs. So you should check that out. And what was the first question? We have him talking this summer for the summer program on that project. Okay, and you said pieces of paper with jokes on them? Because that would be Nechama Epstein, that was her work, classifying Jewish jokes, and published a work on it.
There's just so much material in the YIVO archive that's like very small. Yeah, well,
No, I
The-
agree.
it seems like they collect the material that survived from Vilna. It seems is kind of chaotic in form, and my question is like, has that been systematized by, or was that systematized by the work that was done by YIVO ethnographers?
You should find Epstein's article in YIVO Blätter and her classification of Jewish jokes, Yiddish jokes. It's overwhelming in the YIVO archives how much material there is. Once you start looking at the ethnographic committee and Litvins, there's so much there that no one is working on.
So I guess we have some materials that are kind of in their old-fashioned state, like kvitlach, little small pieces of paper as they came in so many decades ago. And then we also have now newly digitized materials of all kinds, especially recordings, and materials that Leyzer referred to. So much work to do, right? Do we have any other questions?
I think that's a good place to stop. Thank you so much, all of you. Yeah.